The first thing Master Warrant Officer Trevor Banning did when he saw her name on the relay board was laugh, and he made sure the laugh carried. 40 years on rifle ranges had taught him exactly how loud to be. Loud enough that the dozen soldiers around the mound heard it, soft enough that nobody could later say he'd made a scene. "They're letting wedding photographers shoot the long stage now," he said, and tapped the laminated sheet where it read Dunmore P. SGT 3 RCR. He said it the way men like Banning always said things, as if the words were a favor he was doing the room. Petra Dunmore stood 4 meters away with her rifle slung muzzle down and a wind meter clipped to her chest rig, and she did not look up from the little spiral notebook where she was writing numbers. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. As she finished the line she was writing, closed the book, and slid it into her left breast pocket the way she always did, and somehow the not reacting landed harder on Banning than anything she could have said. If you've ever watched someone refuse to give a bully the only thing he came for, you already know how the rest of this goes. If you've ever stood on a cold range at first light waiting for the wind to make up its mind, drop the name of your town in the comments, because this happened on a morning a lot of people thought they understood, and nobody did. It was the 3rd week of October at the Long Range Complex, out past the main impact area at CFB Petawawa, and the Ottawa Valley had turned the color of wet steel. National Combine ran every fall, the unofficial championship where the best rifle shots from across the Canadian Armed Forces came to settle, quietly and with a great deal of pretended modesty, who was actually the best. It was the kind of event careers were measured against. Reservists came hoping a regular force coach would notice them. Veterans came to prove the years hadn't taken the eye. And men like Banning came to remind everyone of an order they believed was permanent. He had won the aggregate 4 times. He had a wall of small bronze medallions and a way of standing on the firing point, feet planted, that told you he considered the ground his by deed. He was 51, built thick through the shoulders, and he had spent so long being the best shooter in any room he walked into that he had stopped being able to tell the difference between being good at something and being owed something for it. That confusion is at the center of this whole story, so it's worth saying plainly now, Banning was not a stupid man. He was a man whose talent had been working for his ego for so long that the two had grown into each other, and he had never once been forced to pull them apart. The relay sheets went up. He stood by the registration tent with a paper coffee going cold in his hand and a small circle of younger shooters arranged around him in the loose orbit that follows powerful people on every base on Earth. There was Corporal Meade, who laughed a half-second before Banning's jokes had finished landing, and 2 others whose names don't matter because they spent the weekend agreeing with whatever the last loud person had said. There was Private Ren Holt, 19, 3 months out of his battle school, holding his rifle like it might still go off on its own, standing at the edge of the circle because the edge felt safer than the center. Holt had grown up being told that the Army was a place where the best rose and the rest got out of the way, and he believed it the way you believe things you haven't yet tested. Spend the next 2 days having that belief taken apart in his hands, slowly, 1 shot at a time, and he would never entirely put it back together the same way. He didn't know that yet. He just stood there and watched a Master Warrant Officer make a joke about wedding photographers, and he laughed too, because everyone else did, and the laughing felt like belonging. 3 rows back, near the ammunition point, the woman they were laughing about was on one knee checking the torque on her scope rings with a small driver, and she heard every word. Sergeant Petra Dunmore was 33 years old, from a wheat town an hour south of Saskatoon, and she had a face that gave nothing away on purpose, because she had learned a long time ago that a calm face is a kind of armor you never have to take off. She'd come up through the infantry the hard way and found, somewhere in the middle of it, the one thing that made the whole loud world go quiet for her, the rifle and the long invisible problem between the muzzle and a target 1,000 meters off. Other people saw shooting as a contest of nerve. Petra saw it as arithmetic that happened to be conducted with a firearm. Speed, wind angle, the slow rightward push of the bullet's own spin, the curvature of the planet adding its small, honest lie to anything past 800 meters, the temperature thinning or thickening the air, the way the light bent over hot ground and turned the target into a swimming smear. She did the math the way other people hummed songs they couldn't get out of their heads. She'd been doing it since she was small. Her father had been a land surveyor before his knees gave out, a quiet man who spent his working life turning the curve of the prairie into numbers, and he'd taught her on the section road behind their house. With a .22 and a row of soup cans and an old anemometer he'd salvaged from a weather station, he never let her be frustrated at a miss. A miss, he told her, was just the wind asking a question she hadn't finished answering. "Wind isn't your enemy," he'd say, crouched beside her in the ditch grass with the cans glinting 200 meters off. "It's not even trying to beat you. It's the most honest thing out here. It only ever tells you exactly what you bothered to ask." He died when she was 26, and she had not cried at the funeral, which her relatives held against her, and she had gone out the next morning to a borrowed range and shot until her shoulder was the color of a plum, because moving was how she grieved and numbers were how she prayed. She carried his anemometer in her kit still. It didn't work anymore. She carried it anyway. So when Banning's laugh reached her at the ammo point, she did not turn around. She tightened the last ring to spec, set the driver down, and let the comment go through her and out the other side, without leaving a mark the way water goes through a net. The young Private Holt happened to be looking at her when she did it, and he noticed, without having any words for it yet, that she hadn't ignored the insult out of weakness. She'd heard it, weighed it, found it worth nothing, and discarded it. That is a different thing entirely, and some part of him filed it away. The first day was the close and middle stages, out to 600 meters, and it sorted the field the way it always did. Banning shot beautifully, there was no taking that from him. Clean, economical, a man performing a craft he genuinely possessed. He finished the day at the top of the aggregate by a comfortable margin, and he made sure to walk the line afterward with his scorecard held just visibly enough, accepting the nods. Dunmore finished fourth, quiet, unremarkable, in the pack, playing relaxed. People who mistake silence for absence usually do. What he didn't see, because he wasn't the kind of man who watched anyone he'd already dismissed, was that Dunmore had shot the entire first day inside a wind that nobody else had read correctly, and had deliberately not chased the last ring of points on 2 stages because the gusts were cycling and she judged the risk not worth the reward. She was managing a longer problem than one day. She knew, the way you know the shape of a hill you've climbed before, that the combine was decided on the second day, on the extended range, at the distances where talent stops being enough and the math takes over. She was saving herself for the air she knew was coming. The senior coach overseeing the combine that year was Major Genevieve Roy, 22 years in, a small, unhurried woman who had run more ranges than most people had fired on, and who had a habit of standing at the back of the firing point with her hands folded, saying nothing, missing nothing. On the first afternoon, she was joined at the back of the point by 3 people in plain civilian pattern fleece, no name tapes, who stood a careful distance off and watched the line with the particular stillness of people who were there to evaluate rather than compete. One of them, a lean woman in her 50s, watched Dunmore through a spotting scope for a long time on the 600 stage and then said something quiet to the man beside her, who wrote it down. Roy noticed them. He noticed everything. She also noticed that the only shooter on the line who clocked the 3 quiet observers and correctly understood what they were, and then went back to her own work as if they were weather, was Sergeant Dunmore. That told Roy more than any scorecard. It came in overnight the way the valley wind does in late October, sweeping down off the Laurentian shoulder and across the open ground with nothing to break it. And by the time the relays formed up on the morning of the second day, the flags on the extended range were standing out stiff and snapping, and then, worse, cycling, slacking and reviving and swinging through 10 or 15 degrees of direction in the space of a breath. To a shooter, a strong, steady wind is a difficulty. A strong cycling wind is something close to cruelty. It means that the answer to the problem changes between the moment you decide to fire and the moment the bullet arrives, and at 1,100 meters that flight takes the better part of 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which the valley can change its mind twice. Half the field's faces, when they walked up and saw those flags, did the small involuntary thing that faces do when a hard day announces itself early. Dunmore's face did the opposite. The narrator will tell you plainly what was happening behind it, because it's the hinge of everything. Where the rest of the line saw chaos, Petra saw a problem that had finally gotten interesting. The cycling wind didn't frighten her, because she didn't experience the wind as a threat at all. She experienced it as a sentence the valley was speaking, and she'd spent her whole life learning the language. Walked to the spotting line, lay down behind her scope and began to read. Not the flags, which lie because they're light and react to the surface wind, but the mirage, the slow boil of heat shimmer that shows the wind's true behavior all the way down the range in layers. She watched it for a long time before she ever asked for her first sighter. The numbers assembled themselves in her head and she wrote them in the little notebook, and the calm that settled over her was not bravery. It's the specific peace of a person who has found the one place in the world where she always knows what to do. The extended stages ran long and they thinned the field fast. 800, then 1,000, then the final relay at 1,100 meters with the wind doing its worst. Shooter after shooter walked away with their cards marked down, good soldiers humbled by air, and quietly, without announcement, the aggregate began to move. Because the points at these distances were worth more, and because almost nobody could hold the center in that wind, a single great string at 1,100 could erase a whole day's deficit. Banning shot the 1,000-meter stage well. He was too good not to, but the narrator wants to be precise about the nature of skill because it matters. Banning shot by feel and memory and a vast bank of experience, which is a real and rare thing. But feel and memory are exactly the tools that fail when the conditions stop matching anything you felt before. He held the wind he expected. The valley wasn't giving him the wind he expected. Drop points he was not used to dropping, and a small ugly knot began to form behind his sternum, the particular discomfort of a man feeling, for the first time in years, the ground he believed was his shifting underfoot. When the scores for the 1,000 posted, the gap had closed to almost nothing, and there were two names at the top of the board, with one stage left between them, his and hers. He found out the way men like him always find out, by overhearing it, by seeing the cluster of soldiers reading the board go quiet and glance toward where he stood. He walked over and read it himself, and the knot behind his sternum pulled tight. The narrator will not pretend this was a fair fight in Banning's mind, because in Banning's mind it had stopped being about shooting some time ago. It had become about the order of the world, the one in which a 51-year-old legend did not get run down on the last stage by a quiet sergeant from a wheat town whom he'd compared to a wedding photographer in front of 40 witnesses. He looked for somewhere to put the feeling, and he did what such men do. He put it on her. He walked the line to where Dunmore was lying behind her rifle, settling in for the final relay, and he stood over her so his shadow fell across her scope. "Real shooting," he said, loud again, the circle reassembling around him out of nowhere. "Isn't reading a cheat sheet. Out here the wind doesn't care how good your arithmetic is." He nudged her notebook, which was lying on the mat by her left hand, with the toe of his boot, just enough to flip it shut. "Let's see it without the homework. No spotter, no sighters. One shot, cold barrel, and you call your own wind in front of everybody. Is the math only good when you've got time to do it on paper?" It was a stupid challenge and a dangerous one, and every experienced shooter on that line knew it. A cold bore shot, the first round from a barrel that hasn't been warmed by previous firing, lands differently from every shot after it, and at 1,100 meters in a cycling wind, called by eye with no sighters to confirm your read, it is closer to a stunt than a test. Major Roy, at the back of the point, took a half step forward to shut it down. But the thing about a challenge thrown loud enough in front of enough people is that refusing it has a cost too, and Banning knew that, and that was the trap. He wasn't really asking her to take the shot. He was building a room where any answer made her smaller. Dunmore reached out, picked up her notebook, and set it back in her breast pocket, unread. She had it memorized anyway. Then she said the only thing she said to him in the entire 2 days, and she said it quietly, without heat, in a voice meant only for the distance between them. "You don't warm a barrel to make the shot easier," she said. "You warm it so you're sure of the truth before you ask someone else to bet on it." "Fine." She looked up the range at the flags and the mirage and the boiling air over the 1,100 meters of cold prairie between her and a target the size of a dinner plate, and she did the thing that separated her from every other shooter on that line and possibly from Banning's entire understanding of what shooting was. She didn't shoot. Not yet. The wind was cycling and she waited for it. The whole line had gone silent now. 200 soldiers and a major and 3 nameless observers, and a thick-shouldered legend standing over her with his arms crossed, all of them watching a woman lie perfectly still behind a rifle and do nothing. The narrator wants to slow down here, because what happened next took about 9 seconds, and it is the center of everything. Down in the butts, the protected trench far downrange where soldiers marked the targets and signaled the hits, there was a relay of markers, and that morning one of them was Private Ren Holt, sent down on the rotation because junior soldiers always draw the butts. The butts are safe by design. The firing line and the targets are surveyed and certain, and no round ever goes near the people in the trench. Just as Dunmore lay waiting for her wind, a gust came through harder than any that morning, hard enough to lift a sheet of range matting that someone had left unweighted near the target frames, and the matting cartwheeled up out of the butt line and tumbled across the open ground at the base of the targets. And Holt, 19 and conscientious and not yet wise, climbed up out of the safety of the trench to chase it, because he'd been told to keep the range tidy, and he was the kind of kid who did what he was told. Several things happened in the same heartbeat. The range safety NCO, Sergeant Pelletier, saw the figure stand up at the base of the targets and shouted, and his voice was torn sideways by the wind. Banning, standing over Dunmore, had already opened his mouth. He had been about to say something else, some final twist of the knife, and his eye was on her, and not on the range. Petra Dunmore, lying behind a cold rifle with her finger indexed along the side of the trigger guard, exactly where her father had taught her to keep it, had her scope up and saw, 1,100 meters away, swimming in the mirage, the unmistakable shape of a human being, stand upright into the line of fire. She did not shoot. That is the whole point, and it is the thing the room would talk about for a year. The lesser shooter, keyed up, ego-baited, with a challenge ringing in her ears and a finger near a trigger, might have already been in the press, might have flinched the round off in surprise. Dunmore came off the trigger guard entirely, flat-palmed the bolt handle down to be certain, and said one word, not loud, but in the clipped carrying tone the Army drills into you for exactly this. Ceasefire. On downrange. And then, because the safety NCO was 30 meters away and fighting the wind and might not be heard, she did the cold-blooded arithmetic of the moment and added the only thing that would actually move a frightened teenager. She came up off the rifle, turned, and put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled, a single piercing note that cut the wind where shouting couldn't, and Holt, far down the range, froze and then dropped, and then scrambled back down into the trench where the earth swallowed him safe. For a moment, nobody moved. The line had gone the kind of silent that has weight. Banning stood over her with his mouth still half open around a sentence he was never going to finish, because he had been so busy trying to make her small that he hadn't been watching the range, and the discipline he just publicly questioned had been the only thing standing between a 19-year-old and a very bad morning. It hadn't been his hand that came off the trigger, it had been hers. He understood that. The narrator can tell you that he understood it instantly and completely, because the thing about a man who has confused performance with substance is that he always knows, somewhere underneath, where the line between them runs, and Banning had just watched her stand on the far side of it. Pelletier got the all clear from the butts a long minute later. The range went hot again. Petra Dunmore lay back down behind her cold rifle as if none of it had touched her, and went back to reading the wind. She waited through 2 more cycles of the gust. A narrator will tell you what she was doing, because it deserves to be understood and not mistaken for magic. She was watching the mirage flatten and run, reading the layered wind down the range in thirds, holding in her head a single moving equation, 1,100 meters of cold air, a left-to-right wind quartering at something between 4 and 7 meters per second and swinging, the bullet's own rightward drift from the spin of the rifling, the small, honest curve of the rotating earth, the density of air gone heavy with cold and damp. And she was not waiting for the perfect condition, because there was no perfect condition. She was waiting for the condition she could trust, the one she could solve cleanly, and the moment she recognized it, she stopped thinking, because the thinking was already done. She settled the crosshair off the target into open air, holding for a wind that was pushing the round somewhere the target wasn't yet, trusting 2 seconds of flight to a number she'd built in her head, and between one heartbeat and the next, on a cold barrel, with no sighter and no spotter, and 200 people holding their breath, she broke the shot. The rifle's report rolled out across the range and the wind took it. 2 seconds is a long time to wait for the truth. Out in the butts, the marker disc came up, found the target, and rose to the center. A clean hit, dead center, 1,100 meters, cold bore, called by eye. The butts signaled it again to be sure, because they didn't believe it either. There was no cheer. That was the strange part, and Holt, climbing back up out of the trench, would remember it for the rest of his life. Mine stayed silent, the way people go silent, not when they're disappointed, but when they've seen something that resets the scale they'd been measuring by. 200 soldiers and a major and 3 quiet strangers, and not one sound, for a full 3 seconds. Dunmore did not get up grinning. She did not look at Banning. She ran her bolt, cleared and made safe with the same flat economy she'd done everything else, sat back on her heels, and looked down the range at the target for a moment, and Major Roy saw this and understood it. She looked downrange not at the target but at the butts, at the place where a teenager had nearly walked into her line, and something moved across her face that had nothing to do with the score. She wasn't thinking about the shot she'd made. She was thinking about the one she hadn't. Banning stood off to the side now, no longer over her, no longer the center of any circle. The little orbit of laughers had dissolved the way such orbits always do the instant the weather changes. He looked, the narrator will say honestly, like a man standing in the wreckage of something he'd built himself and only just now recognized. He'd come to the line that morning certain of an order, left it understanding for the first time in a very long time that he'd been wrong about what the order even was. Major Roy walked over and crouched beside Dunmore and didn't say anything for a moment, just rested a hand on her shoulder. You took a ceasefire that cost you nothing and made a shot that cost you everything you had, Roy said quietly, and you did them in the right order. Dunmore nodded once. He shouldn't have stood up, she said, meaning the boy, not the shot. No, Roy agreed, but you're the one who made sure it didn't matter. And the 3 observers at the back of the point were already walking down the line, and the lean woman in the unmarked fleece was holding out her hand. The combine ended that afternoon, and the aggregate went to Dunmore by a margin nobody bothered to argue. But that's not the part that lasted. What lasted came after. The observers had been the selection cadre for the National Combat Shooting Team, the small group that represented the Canadian Armed Forces at the international matches, a program that had quietly been rebuilt that year after some lean seasons. The letter reached Dunmore 3 weeks later through her chain of command, and Major Roy was the one who handed it to her, in a cramped office at Petawawa with the November rain coming sideways off the river. Petra read it standing up. She read it twice. Roy, who had known her for exactly 2 days and a few letters worth of correspondence and had still somehow come to care how this landed, watched the calm face she wore like armor do something it had not done once in front of anyone. It cracked just at the edges, just enough. The team wanted her, not as a member, as the lead. A man who'd built the program back up had cited, in the formal language of the offer, controlled marksmanship under degraded conditions and demonstrated range discipline under public and adversarial pressure. They were, in other words, offering her the thing on the strength of the exact morning a senior man had tried to use to humiliate her. He said I was a wedding photographer, Petra said very quietly, looking at the letter and not at Roy. 3 weeks ago, in front of everybody. I remember, Roy said, and now they want me to lead the country shooters. Roy didn't answer that, because it didn't need answering. She just let the younger woman stand in the small office with the rain on the window and the letter in her steady hands and feel all the way through the size of the gap between what she'd been told she was and what she'd turned out to be. As for Banning, and the narrator includes this because the satisfying part of a story like this is never the broken thing, it's the rebuilt one. He did not vanish and he was not destroyed, and that turned out to matter. He finished out the season quietly, requested the following spring to be removed from the coaching cadre, and people assumed it was bitterness until they learned he'd asked instead to run the safety and fundamentals course for junior shooters, the unglamorous job, the one that's all about discipline and nothing about glory. A man who has spent 15 years confusing being loud with being good does not change because he loses once. He changes, if he changes at all, because the losing shows him something true about himself that he can no longer unsee, and Banning had stood on that line and watched a quieter, better shooter take her finger off a trigger when his whole attention had been on his own wounded pride, and he had understood exactly what that meant about the two of them. It cost him a year of being honest with himself, which is the most expensive year there is. It was 11 months later, at the next combine, that he settled it. The aggregate had just been awarded to Dunmore again, and she was standing at the front of the gathered shooters with the small bronze medallion in her hand when a thick-shouldered man came forward from the back of the room and stopped a careful distance from her, and the room, which had been applauding, went still because every person there knew the two names and knew the story. Asked quietly if he could say something. She looked at him for a moment, reading him the way she read everything, without suspicion and without charity, just with the flat, accurate attention of someone trained to see what's actually present. Then she nodded and stepped back from the microphone. Most of you know who I am, Banning said, and a lot of you know why. He didn't have notes. I'm not going to explain myself because there's nothing to explain. I spent a long career believing that being the best shooter in the room meant the room belonged to me. And then I stood beside a sergeant who was about to take a shot I'd dared her into, and I watched her take her finger off the trigger for a kid she'd never met, and I understood that I'd had it backwards my whole life. I thought discipline was what you did when somebody was watching. She showed me it's the thing that's there when nobody is. He turned to face her directly, the same flat, honest eye contact she'd given him a year before. Sergeant Dunmore. What you did on that line wasn't just better shooting than mine. It was a better understanding of what the shooting is for. I've thought about those 9 seconds more than I've thought about anything in my life. And then in front of 200 soldiers in the same quiet cadre in the rebuilt national program, Master Warrant Officer Trevor Banning put out his hand. Petra looked at it. She looked at his face and read what was there, and found that it was real. She took his hand, and the applause that came then was not the sound of a crowd that had been entertained. It was older and quieter than that, the sound of people who'd just watched something rearrange, even slightly, what they'd believed about how a person changes and how long it takes and what it costs. In the back row stood a young corporal now, promoted that spring, who'd once been a 19-year-old private who climbed out of a trench he should have stayed in. Holt watched the handshake and felt the same thing shift in his chest that he'd felt the morning the whistle cut the wind and dropped him back into the earth alive. He had a word for it now, 11 months on. It was the feeling of a belief you'd been handed turning out to be smaller than the world and having to grow it on the spot to hold what you'd just seen. It had never once been comfortable. It was still the most important thing he'd ever felt. Afterward, in the cold hallway outside with the rain doing what Ottawa Valley rain does in October, Major Roy found Petra standing alone by a window. "How do you feel?" Roy asked. Petra thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Like something finished," she said. "Not ended. Finished. There's a difference." Roy nodded slowly and said nothing, and after a while Petra spoke again, almost to herself, looking out at the gray running glass. "Father," she said, "would have hated all of it. The medallions, the attention, the speeches. He'd have stood in the back with his hands in his pockets being embarrassed for everyone, but he'd have understood the handshake. He used to say the measure of a shooter was never the shot you make. Anybody can be proud of a hit. The measure is the shot you don't take and what you do in the quiet right after. Whether you go looking for someone to be bigger than, or whether you just clear your weapon, make it safe, and get up. She watched the rain a moment longer. I think I finally know what he meant by that, she said. Then Sergeant Petra Dunmore straightened up, the way her father had taught her to before she ever fired a round, breathed out the cold valley air, and walked back into the room and the rest of her life, not as a story, not as the woman from the clip the matches had been talking about all year, just as herself, which in the end was the only thing she'd ever been trying to be, and which had turned out, the wind had finally agreed, to be more than enough.